Hello everyone. In this video we'll cover some of the preloading options, some teleporting between scenes, and general control between the position of players in between loading of scenes and such. So let's just go through this scene that I've set up here so that we can cover the basics and you know how it's set up. First of all, we have a standard player from the Unity starter assets, so you can go and get that on the Unity asset page. Then I have also added some teleporters, also from the Unity asset store. The whole deal here is that they have a collider, and that collider is set to trigger, so I can very easily use that trigger to move into and go to other scenes. I have another scene as well called level 2. This one is called main, which is the main scene that I'll be loading. This could contain a menu system or whatnot. I'm just controlling everything through the teleporter. If I go to level 2, you can see level 2 doesn't have any controllers for players or anything like that. It has a teleporter pad just because I copy pasted the scene. And I have added another plane over here. So this is just called plane 01. And on that plane, I have something that is called the spawn point. So over here, there is this label here that says spawn point. So here back in the main scene, the first thing that I will set up is an empty game object that contains all the functionalities of our base game. First of all, I'm going to click over here in my hierarchy, right click and create empty. I'm going to call this _app, just as this is my app. You could call it whatever you want, it's just an empty game object. I'm going to take my nested parent armature, this is the full game controller that I have here. I'm going to drag and drop that into app. This is now located on app itself, meaning that we can now go into the app itself here and add a script to it. So I'm going to add a script. I'm going to call it DDOL. It's called Do Not Destroy on Load. When Unity is done compiling, double click the script. In the script, delete the start and the update method, add an awake method. And inside of the awake method, the only thing that we will do here is don't destroy on load. And then of course, this current game object. So let's save this file and jump back into Unity. And essentially what happens now is that inside of the app here, we have do not destroy on load, meaning every time there is a deload or a load of a new scene, this is gonna stay living. So it's not gonna get destroyed or gonna get moved from this scene. This is also why the level 2 scene here, I'm gonna save this one. This level 2 scene doesn't have the controller because the controller is now gonna live fully inside of our app. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up the teleporter to be able to send us to the other scene. So select whatever you have as a teleporter with the trigger on it. Click add component and set up a scene changer. So inside of this script here, again, we'll delete all the content of the class itself. So we need to be using Unity engine and the scene management. So I'm going to copy paste this line and go and also load the scene management. So inside of the public class scene changer here, I'll set up an on trigger enter. And if something enters the trigger, we'll say scene manager dot load scene. And this one needs a name. So in this case here, we could hard code it. We could also just set in a variable here. So if we just say load scene like this, and up here we set up a new public string. This now means anytime something enters the trigger, the load scene string is gonna get fired so that we load the new scene with that specific name. If you want to make sure that this always is the player that is the only one who can actually access the teleporter, you need an if statement around this one. If other.compare tag and the tag name is player, then do this. This just means that if you throw any other object or something falls into this trigger, nothing's really going to happen. Only if the tag of the other game object that hits the trigger is set up as player, something will happen. So again, let's save. Let's jump back into Unity. And inside of Unity here, we now have our load scene. And I know that this scene here is called LVL2, so LVL2. So one thing that we need to set up still is the index of all the builds. So go to your build settings, please. So inside of the build settings, either your main scene is already loaded or there's nothing here. All the scenes that you want to be part of your game need to be inside of this list here. So you can just drag your scenes over and they should all be available right here. This is the only thing that we need, but if they aren't present here and you walk into one of those triggers that need to load a new scene, you will actually get an error thrown that just says can't find that build index. So now we're gonna play. And if we walk over here into the teleporter, we get teleported to the new scene. But as you could see, we got teleported just to the other side of that teleporter path, which in some cases, in some games might be something you want, just like the same position in some other scene. But in this case, it means that we're outside of this plain square here could also mean that in your game you're suddenly just within a wall. So we actually need to figure out how to set up these spawn points. I'm just going to show you very quickly how it's set up in the level 2, just so that you know how to set up your own spawn points. Spawn point in level 2 is right over here. You just right click, create empty, then you name it. In this case I named it spawn point. Nothing more. I just went over here, clicked this menu so that I could add a label to it. This just means that you can now see these 3D icons if you actually need to see where your spawn points are, because empty objects can be quite hard to see. So in this case, it just has a level when we get to it and we can see it's called spawn point. That's essentially it. It doesn't need more. Of course, you need to position it where you want your player to be able to spawn to in level 2, but the rest is going on in the main scene over here. So now what we need to do is we need to set up a new script on our app. So click the app and add a new component. This new component should be the script that should find the spawn point. So I'm gonna call it spawn point finder. So in this spawn point finder, we'll delete all the content of the class again. We'll make sure that we have the scene management as a library that is loaded. And what we wanna make sure here is that we're subscribing to when the scene has been loaded. That just makes it so that we know exactly which scene we're in so that we can differentiate between the different spawn points that you might have in your different levels. So in here, we want to have a private transform for our player. We also want to be able to figure out what our spawn point is and where our spawn point is. So we'll set up a private game object for our spawn point. So the player actually needs to be set by us, but we don't want it to be something that can just change or be edited on the fly. So we'll set this up as a serialized field. So next up here is we'll set up a function that looks for if the scene has been loaded or not. So let's say private void function, non-return function, and we'll call it scene loaded. We'll give it some parameters, so scene and scene, and then just for the mode, so where in the process are we, we're gonna set up a load scene mode and just call it mode. So this now means that we can subscribe to this scene loaded event. So we'll set up a on enable. Inside of on enable, we'll call the scene manager dot scene loaded, and we'll subscribe to the scene loaded. So in this case, we also want an on disable. And in here, we're essentially doing the same thing. So scene manager is scene loaded, but we're unsubscribing to the event. So if the event is non-existent. Inside of our scene loaded method down here, we can set up an if statement to check if we're on the right scene. So let's say if, and we'll look for the scene.name, and we want this name to be equal to a string, and that should be the scene name. So in this case, level 2. Now we want to find our spawn point. So we'll say spawn point should now be equal to GameObject.find, and then inside of this find, it should look for the GameObject named spawn point. I think I capitalized it. So next up is a bit of physics trickery so that we make sure that we set the new position and then we update the physics engine, because the player that we're playing is a physics-based character. So let's say player.set position and rotation, and it needs a lot of parameters, this one here. So we want the spawn point dot transform dot position, and the rotation, then say player dot transform dot rotation. So we keep the same rotation as before, but we have set the new position being the spawn point's position. Then we'll update the physics engine. So we'll write physics dot sync transform. So this is a method like so. I'm gonna save this script now. Then I'm gonna jump back into Unity. So when Unity is done compiling, we need to set up a player transform here. The player itself is actually located inside of the nested prefabs. All the way down here, it's called the player armature. This is also the one that is tagged player. If we move the player armature around, the camera and all of that stuff is gonna follow. So I click the app again, I take my player armature and I drag that into my transform for the player here. I'm gonna save my scene here. When the scene is saved, I'm gonna click play. So now I can move around, and as soon as I walk into the teleporter, I should be teleported to the next scene and then somewhere over there on the new platform. And just like that, we're now on that new platform on the spawn point itself. And this is something that you can then extend upon, meaning you can go into the script, and in here you can just set up a bunch of if statements. So if and if else. if you're on level 2, level 3, and so on and so forth, and set up new spawn points to move your player around. So this was how to set up Do Not Destroy on Load as like a preloader, and how to teleport in between scenes and set up a new spawn point for each new scene. Thank you for watching, everyone.